right. All right. Well, thank you for coming today. This is our first virtual author event here at Russell Specialty Books and Gifts. So thank you everybody for coming. And thank you those of you who are watching the video. I appreciate that too. So today we have as our guinea pig, Mr. Lars Hedbor. He is he's an amateur. I don't know when you find time to work if you are an amateur historian, because you do a lot of historian work. Why don't you kind of just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So in my day job, I'm a technical writer. I have 6 children. I am a novelist of the American Revolution, actually one of the most prolific novelists of the Revolution around. I run a small publishing business. I work with foreign exchange students. I'm a licensed pyrotechnician.
Okay, wait. What is a license? Do you set off fireworks?
I have set off fireworks, yes, I do that.
I have never met anybody who actually sets off fireworks.
Yep.
At least not authorized fireworks.
Right. Which means I can't set off the unauthorized ones anymore because I can't.
You get in all kinds of trouble then, yes.
Right. And then I'm also an amateur home brewer, very bad fiddle player, and linguist. I stay out of trouble.
Well, you do write about the Revolution, and wasn't that the age of the Enlightenment, and where people were, they weren't just narrowly defined by one profession, they just did everything that pleased them?
Some people did that for sure. Thomas Jefferson is a very well-known example of a polymath, and there were a lot of them.
That's a great word. That's a new word to me. A
polymath, somebody who studies all kinds of things.
Awesome. Well, you learn something new every day, right?
I sure try.
There you go. So, all of these things that you do, what on earth drew you to write books about the American Revolution?
Well, the American Revolution, I think, unfortunately gets overlooked in a lot of history, particularly American history, because we get so focused on the Civil War. And the Civil War was a big event, don't get me wrong. The American Revolution, to my mind, was a very important inflection point, not just in American history, but in human history. For the first time, our concept of what government was for was not to decide which prince would get to rule over a patch of dirt, but what government was for essentially was redefined by the American Revolution. The ideas had been raised by the Enlightenment, but they were first put into practice in our revolution. We see, and our revolution inspired movements and revolutions and changes in all of human history since. Whereas our Civil War was just another Civil War, honestly, like so many before and after. We see just last year the protesters in Hong Kong were running around flying American flags, and the protesters in Tiananmen Square built a model of the Statue of Liberty, not because they admired our current form of government necessarily, but because they were absolutely fired up by the ideas that found their first expression in the American Revolution.
Because it wasn't common for colonies to just break off from the motherland. I mean, wasn't this the first time anybody had ever done that?
It's the first one I can think of offhand. I'm sure, if you go back into Greek history and so forth, I'm sure there were instances of that sort. But again, those were more civil wars. They were squabbles between princes over who was going to, manage a particular area of ground, and not fights over the very concept of government.
Awesome. So your series is called Tales from a Revolution. And how many books do you have in this series now?
I have 11 as of this last month.
Wow. So tell us about the series. Kind of give us an overview. Oh, I'm sorry, Joan, you were turning sideways there for a minute.
Sorry, I moved my phone.
So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to write one for each of the colonies and many of the future states as well. I've gone well beyond the original 13 already. I've written about Vermont, which was an independent republic. I've written about East Florida, or excuse me, West Florida. I haven't written East Florida yet, which was actually a colony, but we don't remember it.
Yeah, we all think it was Spanish, or at least I thought it was Spanish.
Yeah, I've written about Nova Scotia. So, you know, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to tell the stories of ordinary people, because we always hear about Washington and Jefferson, and now we've heard all about Hamilton. We can sing all the tunes.
Yeah.
But we hardly ever hear from the ordinary people, people like you and I, sitting at their kitchen tables, struggling with how to make sense of a world that has gone completely mad around them. So what I try to do is I try to take us to those kitchen tables, let us hear those anguished conversations. What are we going to do? And let us see how the outcomes of those conversations wind up shaping history. Because we often think of history as being made by these great figures astride their white horses and great heroes. Those people could not have done what they did without people like you and I making things happen on the ground. And so I try to make that very clear, that the choices that we make will wind up affecting history in the future. And part of that is to make people a little bit more mindful of the choices that they make.
Yeah. Although they won't have letters anymore to research that. How did you research ordinary people? Because I know I was listening to one historian who said that she wrote about kings and queens simply because there's a lot of source material about kings and queens. How did you find source material to write about ordinary people?
Well, we have a surprising number of letters and journals and so forth. So I've read a lot of those. I read the newspapers that they read. I read the pamphlets that influence them. And I write about ordinary people specifically because there's not a lot of source material, because when you have a lot of source material, it becomes very easy to make mistakes. I have one scene in one of my books where Benedict Arnold makes an appearance, and I don't usually write historical figures, and here's why. I made a comment in the story about his piercing blue eyes. And then later on, I was reading a very serious history of Benedict Arnold, and one of the early passages in that history mentioned that he had startlingly green eyes.
Oh, no.
So what are you going to do?
Somebody's going to send you an email.
Yeah, I'm going to get angry emails.
Yeah. The green-eyed people are going to send you an email.
Right. So I actually like the ambiguities that ordinary people leave in the holes in the records that they leave, because I can write stories into those ambiguities. You know, I'm in the middle of writing a novel about an historical figure who happens to be an ancestor of mine, and there's a great deal of his history that is pretty well documented, and the places where it's not as well documented are the places where I can be a little bit more free in terms of telling a story. Anybody can write down, can transcribe the stuff that's been documented, and don't let me hasten to add that I'm not meaning to demean the process of taking that data and turning it into a story that makes sense. But in order to write a story about characters who are alive in my mind and can, you know, tell their own stories, I've got to have some of those gray areas to write into.
Yeah, and I think, you know, every now and then I hear a concern, I don't want to read historical fiction because the authors are just making it up, that kind of thing. But many, many, many of the authors I've spoken to who write historical fiction are just devoted to making it as authentic as humanly possible.
I once spent, I stayed up most of the night one time reading somebody's master's thesis on the economics of piracy in the Caribbean in the 1750s. And wow. I did that. It was fascinating.
There's not enough coffee to make me do that.
But I did that because I wanted to deeply inform a fairly short scene in one of my books where one of the characters had been a French pirate in the Caribbean in that era. And so I wanted to make sure I got that right. I've also, and sometimes I go down rabbit holes with this stuff. I spent hours one time researching exactly what trees my character would have seen on a ridge line in a particular place at a particular season.
Oh,
And
wow.
and then ended up cutting the scenes.
Well, at least you could have had him see chestnut trees, because chestnut trees hadn't all died out by then, hadn't they?
Right. And I've actually had people write to me and say, "Oh, that bird that you heard, that your character heard singing, didn't occur in North America until 1850." And I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I missed that one."
Yeah, there was somebody decided that they were going to have every bird that appears in Shakespeare imported over to the United States. That's how we got starlings in the United States. So I don't know when he did it or what he was thinking, but that's how we got starlings. So the point I'm making, though, is that these aren't just fluff out of your imagination. Gosh, I think I'll write this. These are very well researched books.
Well, and the first one that I wrote, or the first one I published, I should say, I sent it over to, this was the one based in Vermont, and I sent it to the director of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum to see if he would give me a blurb. And he got back to me after he read it and he said, I usually can't read historical fiction because it really upsets my wife when I throw books across the room. He said, there was nothing in your book that couldn't have happened the way you wrote it.
That is high praise. That is high praise.
That's what I'm trying to accomplish. And it's my hope that these books can be used to supplement classroom materials, classroom teaching.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, because I know that on your website, which is, by the way, got your pencils ready, Lars D Hedbor, HEDBOR.com. It will be on the Facebook page. I know that you have a whole section for educators.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that.
So I do a couple of things for educators, and this is open to any educator, homeschool or formal school of any sort. First of all, if you want a free ebook copy to assess my book and decide if it's right for your classroom or for your teaching, just drop me a line and I'll be glad to send that to you. And secondly, I have discussion guides that I've put together for each of the books that basically guide you and your students through a deeper consideration of the history around the story, as well as some of, obviously when we're in a literature class or whatever, we like to consider questions of the characters' motivations and so forth. So I have some of that in there as well. Awesome.
So I know that it's a terrible thing to ask a writer this. It's like choosing between your 6 children. And I hate it when people ask me this about my books. Do you have a favorite?
I get asked this a lot, and so I've given it a lot of thought, and I can name 3 books that I think that I'm particularly proud of, let's just say. The first one is titled The Smoke, and it's set in New York. That one tells the story of how—
And we have that one, by the way.
Oh, fantastic. That one tells the story of how the Iroquois Confederation, the Haudenosaunee, was actually torn apart as the 6 tribes that made up that confederation were forced to choose sides in a fight that wasn't their own. That one has earned very high praise from reviewers, particularly reviewers who know that culture well, because I was able to essentially, because of the way the story unfolded, I was able to explore that culture from a very open point of view and really dig into some of the cultural beliefs and practices and so forth in a very respectful and hopefully really interesting way. And I've had reviewers say that they really appreciated that my characters in that didn't, I didn't fall into the trap of casting them as noble savages or whatever. They're human, and they love and they grieve and they triumph and they fail in the same ways that we all do.
And for those of us in Kansas, and that's where we are, the tribes I have seen, the tribes that were back east, had a very different lifestyle than the nomadic tribes that we see in Kansas, Wyoming, Colorado, where I have also lived. And so can you tell us a little bit about, what kind of They weren't living in teepees. What kind of lifestyle did they have?
They had established settlements. They were capable of moving around, and they certainly ranged through their territory pretty widely. But they had towns. They had and even fairly substantial towns. You know, not to get too much into the story, but basically because some of the tribes had allied themselves with the British, the Americans sent an expedition up into New York to wipe out the Iroquois, and without much regard for which side of the divide they had come down on. So, yeah, and that forms a fairly major theme in the story.
I would think.
Yeah.
So you were telling me about other favorites. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. So the next one that I'm particularly proud of, a few years ago, I was reading a news article that kind of blew my mind. It was about a former mayor in North Carolina who had been doing some research into his genealogy, and he discovered he had an ancestor who had been a slave, had been freed, and had chosen to fight for the Revolution. And as I started researching, I said, "Oh my gosh, that's a heck of a story," because I've heard of the British attempts to bring slaves into the fight on their side. Lord Dunsmore's proclamation in Virginia is particularly well known, and basically he offered them their freedom if they'd come and fight for the British cause. I hadn't heard about too many fighting for the American side, and I hadn't heard very much about freedmen fighting for the American side. Salem Poor up at Bunker Hill was one that I'd heard of, but and spoke about on a television show that I was on a few years ago. So anyway, I started researching this, and I discovered that it was even more remarkable than I had initially considered, because the laws of North Carolina at the time were that if you were freed as a slave, you had 6 months to get out of the colony, or you'd be sold back into slavery. So for somebody whose entire existence was that devalued and given so little regard, to choose to fight for freedoms that he knew he would never get to experience himself, is such a statement of faith in the future that I thought it was really worth exploring. And so I'm really proud of that story. And then the third one I'm really proud of for a different reason, and that's because it's a huge story in the American Revolution that we never hear about. It's how the Spanish saved the American Revolution. We always hear about the
Spanish, the French.
The Spanish, right? No, we always hear about the French, and we hear about Lafayette and everything. But
maybe he had good PR and the Spanish didn't.
Well, maybe. It may have had something to do with the fact that the French actually entered the war allied with the United States. The Spanish entered the war allied with France.
So they were mostly fighting anti-British than anything else.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely. And that story is it's one that you hear stories and you're like, oh, he just made that up. This one, the straight history is so unbelievable that I really enjoyed investigating it and deciding to write about it. I got started on this one because I was at a dinner party and a friend of my father said, well, when are you going to write about Florida? Because he knew I wrote about the Revolution. Florida? I never thought about Florida. And he said, oh, you got to look into it. So I started doing some research and very quickly learned that the Spanish governor of Spanish America he was based out of New Orleans, and he was very friendly to the American cause. He let Americans smuggle right past him up the Mississippi. And then the instant that he got word that Spain was in the war, he put together a fleet to go up the Mississippi and take the forts that the British had on the Mississippi, so that the British couldn't come overland from the east and attack our rear. He was really trying to do the most strategic thing he could to support the American Revolution. So the day before he was supposed to sail up the Mississippi, a hurricane came up and wiped out his fleet.
Oh no!
But that didn't even slow him down. He went overland, went up the Mississippi, took the forts. I think he lost like 2 men,
Oh, wow.
And took the entire Mississippi away from the British and secured our east flank.
But that
just
would
like
have been
that.
huge.
Absolutely huge, and we have wonderful letters between this guy and George Washington, where they're discussing tactics, and Congress actually promised to hang his portrait in the halls of Congress if he succeeded.
And did they?
Well, they got around to it just a couple years ago.
Oh.
But they did it.
There you go. Well,
yeah.
Congress never acts really fast, do they?
No, and sometimes they're slower than
couple
other
hundred
times.
years,
Yeah. But the thing that's really amazing about this story is that wasn't where he stopped. He said, okay, well, the next major point of strength for the British is in Mobile Bay. There's a fort there, Fort Charlotte. And it so happened that the British commander there was a friend of his. And so we have these wonderful letters between the two of them. But as he arrived at Mobile Bay, another storm came up. And this time it didn't wipe out his fleet, but it did destroy a lot of supplies and so forth. And he had to wait for resupply from Havana before he could proceed. Then he went ahead and besieged the fort. And he sends this letter to his friend saying, I've got you surrounded. You can give up. And his friend wrote back, oh, you don't have me at all yet. And he writes back, you see that smoke over there? That's your house and your belongings.
Oh,
sorry about that. Had to do it.
Oh my gosh.
So finally, he knocks down one wall of the fort, and the British commander says, "Okay, fine, you got me." And they march out in good order and give up. So then all that's left is Pensacola, which is the capital of the British the British holdings in East and West Florida. And so he puts together a huge fleet because he knows it's going to be a really tough nut to crack. Down in Havana, as soon as they sail out of Havana Harbor, the biggest storm yet. Huge hurricane.
Oh my gosh.
I know, you could.
This
I'm
guy
not
is
making this up.
really out of luck where weather is concerned.
Oh my gosh. This one blows up, sinks about half his fleet, and he actually has to turn around and limp back home. But the very next season, he turns around, sails up to Pensacola. The way that the British had that arranged, there was a very narrow passage to get into the harbor there. And they had guns on both sides, of course, so that they could shoot at anybody who was coming in. So the Spanish naval commander said, yeah, no, not going to do it. And this general says, fine, if you won't, I will. Stands up on the prow of his ship, leading the ship through the channel into the bay. He was actually challenged to a duel by the naval commander, who was so embarrassed.
Oh my, oh my.
And then they start firing on the British fort. They get really lucky, and a shot hits the powder magazine in the British fort, blows up the whole fort.
Oh my.
And the British give up at that point and say, fine,
Yeah.
you can have both East and West Florida. We're done. And we don't remember this guy's name at all, except for the name of the city, Galveston, Texas. His name was Bernardo de Galvez.
Is that where they got that? Oh.
Yep.
But it's in Texas, and he was not even in Texas.
He was in Spanish America at that time, extended basically
All the
from
way to
Mississippi
Mexico.
out west, yeah, and down to Mexico. So that was part of his holdings at that time.
Wow.
And of course, then he ended up with all of Florida.
Wow, wow. So let me, I have 3 of your books in the store. We talked about the smoke. Let me show the light.
Yes.
And the light is New Jersey. Why don't we talk a little about New Jersey?
Sure. So the story that I told there was the story of the Quakers. The Quaker faith, if you're not familiar with it, is one that commands its adherents to absolute nonviolence. And that, of course, in a time of war is problematic. So many of the Quakers were subjected to fines and so forth because they refused to help out when they were called upon to do so. The other side of that coin was that there was a very strong belief that if the British won, they would impose the Church of England across the colonies and end the religious freedom that had existed here. And so you're, on the one hand, you're faced with an existential threat to your ability to practice your faith, and on the other hand, you're stuck on the horns of what your faith commands you to do. And what I learned in researching that era was that there were some people, among them was very famously Betsy Ross, who chose to support the revolution without necessarily taking up arms themselves. Many of the more, and I hesitate to use the word orthodox, but the more strict Quakers felt that this was a real violation of the tenets of nonviolence, and actually had them read out of meeting, had them thrown out of their congregations.
Wow.
Yeah. So the struggles in that book are much less military and much more philosophical. So that was a really interesting one to write, and many of my readers consider that to be their favorite.
Now, you may not know this, and this is just out of curiosity, but Madison was a Quaker, I believe. Did they also read him out with the War of 1812?
I don't know. I'm not aware of that.
That's not your war.
No, it's not. Although it's another one that's woefully neglected. So it does have its fascinations. If I ever run out of stories to tell about the American Revolution, the War of 1812 it's an era that I could see spending some time in.
And then you can email me the answer to my question.
I'll probably do that anyway, just because.
His wife was Quaker, and I don't. Maybe both of them. I'm not sure. So
okay.
The other book that I have in the store is The Prize.
Yes, that one's near and dear to my heart. Sorry.
And the Prize is Vermont.
Yep, very near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Vermont, and I grew up actually on Lake Champlain. And there's an island there that you can see from the shore of the place where I grew up called Carleton's Prize. And it's called that because the British General Guy Carleton, in the course of the war, chased Benedict Arnold and his fleet down the lake. And the story is that he stopped and fired on this island because it looked like a ship to him. And we know that story has some truth to it because we've recovered cannonballs from the bed of the lake right along the sides of that island. So, okay, we've got that. And then the local legend is that he was encouraged in this belief that it was a ship by somebody who hung a lantern or a flag or maybe both on the island to make it look even more like a ship. And I said, okay, that's a story. I've got to tell that person's story. I've got to tell that.
Now, what was their motivation? Were they trying to get them to waste cannonballs, or I mean, what was their motivation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Every shot that's wasted on the island is a shot that doesn't get fired at an American ship. Also, as it worked out, because the British fleet stopped to fire on this ship, this island. The American fleet was actually able to slip away and get down south. They wound up having to give up their fleet and escaped, but they did escape. They weren't destroyed at that time.
And that was back when Benedict Arnold was a good guy.
Absolutely, yeah. That was back when he was with us.
People forget he was a very successful leader before he went over to the British.
And he was not as successful for the British, although he was, let us say, notable. Although he ended his days as just kind of a very boring retired general in England, and really very lonely and sad.
Ah, poor little Benedict.
Yeah, well, a lot of people wanted him to end his days dancing on a noose. So
yes, and he did not do that. No, he did not do that. So what's next for you?
Well, I've just released my newest book, and that book is based in Connecticut. It is about prisoners of war, and in this case, they happen to be loyalist prisoners of war who were stuffed into an abandoned copper mine in Connecticut.
Oh my!
Yeah, and as far as I haven't come across any other fiction of the American Revolution that talks about prisoners of war at length. And so I really thought it was worth exploring what their experience was like. The American prisoners of war were stuffed onto dismasted ships in New York Harbor and other harbors, and suffered terribly. Basically, more people left those ships by death than by earning their freedom. But anyway, the Connecticut story was one that I found really fascinating. There was a jailbreak that happened, and so writing about that, incorporating that into my story was a lot of fun. I released that a little bit ahead of schedule because of the pandemic. I felt like my readers would appreciate having a little bit more material.
You bet.
And the other thing that I've done as a result of the pandemic is I've for my ebooks, which of course I know you don't sell, but
That's okay.
they are all 99 cents down from their normal $6.99 for the duration, and that's both because I know people want something to escape into, and also because these books are definitely useful for anybody trying to keep their kids engaged in history and learning about the past. And because I do write very clean, I don't have any sex on stage, and the violence is it's a war, so there is some violence, but it's not excessive.
It's not gruesome and right.
Yeah, and the language is kept clean, because from the beginning I've had in mind that these were potentially useful in a classroom setting. So I really have tried very hard to maintain that standard. So those are available at a reduced cost, and of course, again, any educator of any stripe is welcome to reach out to me, and I'm glad to do appearances like this. And once this is all over, I'm happy to do in-person appearances, particularly locally. But we can talk about having me come out to your location.
Yeah, if you're ever driving along I-70 for any purpose, here we are in the middle of Kansas.
Yep. Yeah. So, and in terms of what's next, I've got a book written about a guy who gets wounded in South Carolina and travels home to recover and experience some peace in his hometown of Yorktown.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so that gets kind of sticky pretty quickly.
It would.
And that was a really interesting book to write because there is so much historical detail available. I had to be very careful to hew to the historical details that we have, and at the same time give my characters some freedom to live their lives.
So again, if anybody wants one of those books, just check it. Are you only on Amazon, or are you all over the place?
I'm everywhere.
Everywhere. So go to your favorite ebook. When you're not going to come in and buy the 3 I have, go to your favorite ebook place and just look for Lars D. Hedbor.
Yep.
And if you are a parent educating your kids, or you're a teacher and you'd like to use some of this material, you have a submit an inquiry.
Yeah.
So larsdhedbor.com. That's where you can find that information. Thank you, Lars, for being
You're so welcome.
And by the way, for having to do this twice because I messed up the recording. This recording hopefully will be available on my Facebook page. So please check it out. We'll have the website printed on the Facebook page, so you can just click on it and go. We're going to do these every other Saturday. Hopefully I will get better at them as they go along. But thank you very much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Joan.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.